El workshop lleva por título Postpandemic Education, Opening New Scape for Comparative and International Education. Estamos muy contentos de estar acá. Va a ser un evento híbrido con asistentes, ¿cierto? Acá en la sede Santiago de la Universidad de los Lagos, en las dependencias del IESED. Y también va a contar con participación de colegas de la Universidad de Tarapacá y particularmente del doctorado en educación que lidera nuestro colega Carlos Mondaca, que está ahí ya visible. Dicho eso, quisiera darle la palabra a Carlos para que dé una bienvenida a nombre del programa de doctorado en educación. Carlos, tienes la palabra. Bienvenido a ti y a los colegas, ¿cierto?, que están incorporándose a través de la plataforma Zoom y a través de esta vía. Adelante, Carlos, gracias.
Ya, bueno, muy buenas tardes a todos y todas. Reitero los agradecimientos, Oscar, y a todos ustedes, y en particular al doctor Charles Wolfhuter, por esta oportunidad que nos dan para poder ser parte de acá desde la frontera norte de Chile, nuestros estudiantes y nuestros académicos del claustro del programa de doctorado en educación. Así que desde ya muchas gracias por esta oportunidad que nos dan.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Comentar también que en la modalidad de este taller, la idea es que primero presente el profesor Wolfhuter y acto seguido vamos a tener una ronda de preguntas, vamos a tener una conversación, ¿cierto?, donde vamos a poder interactuar y dialogar con nuestro colega, ¿ya? Se trata de un académico con larga trayectoria. El profesor Wolfhuter es un destacado comparativista y estudioso de temas relativos a la educación internacional, y junto con ello, ¿cierto?, él se ha enfocado preferentemente en temas relativos a historia de la educación comparada. El profesor Wolfhuter estudió en la Universidad de Johannesburgo, la Universidad de Pretoria, la Universidad de Sudáfrica y la Universidad de Stellenbosch. Se doctoró en educación comparada en la Universidad de Stellenbosch. Ha sido profesor en el Departamento de Historia de la Educación y Educación Comparada de la Universidad de Pretoria y de la Universidad de Zululand, y en la actualidad es profesor de Educación Comparada e Internacional en la Universidad del Noreste de Sudáfrica. Adicionalmente, mencionar que el profesor Wolfhuter ha sido profesor visitante en diversas universidades en el mundo, incluyendo, entre otras, ¿cierto?, la Universidad de Brock en Canadá, la Universidad Estatal de Bowling Green en Ohio, Estados Unidos, la Universidad de Creta en Grecia, la Universidad de Queensland en Australia, la Universidad Normal de Pekín en China, la Universidad de Zhengzhou en China igualmente, la Universidad de Canterbury Christ en Reino Unido, la Universidad de Módena y Reggio Emilio en Italia, la Universidad de Hong Kong, la Universidad de Sydney en Australia y la Universidad de Eberhard-Karls en Alemania. Y por último, indicar que el profesor Wolfhuter ha sido autor de numerosos trabajos académicos, libros, capítulos de libros y artículos, muchos de ellos publicados en revistas muy prestigiosas en temas relativos a educación comparada e internacional. Y en los últimos años también ha estado publicando bastante en series, ¿cierto?, coordinadas por un académico muy cercano a nosotros que también se ha dedicado a estos temas y que es Alexander Weissman, ¿cierto? Y el profesor Wolfhuter en estos últimos 3 o 4 años ha estado publicando bastante con él. Así que dicho eso, doy la palabra al profesor Wolfhuter. Welcome again, Charles. So now you have all the time you need to make your presentation. The audience is yours.
The topic of my presentation is the new scope that I see is opening up for the scholarly field of comparative and international education by the COVID pandemic.
Okay, Charles, go ahead with the next slide. Sorry.
Okay, my thesis is that the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic has opened up new vistas, new possibilities, new scope for the field of comparative and international education. So with this presentation, I want to investigate the potential of the disruption and the ravage brought by the COVID-19 pandemic to education. At the same time, the potential that has for comparative and international education to break out of its documented stagnation. So I will commence with a survey of the historical evolution of the field of comparative and international education. The aim of that is to show you how the field went through a series of successive phases of development. Each time it was shaped and formed and determined by the exigencies, by the necessities, by the reality context of the day in the world. At the same time, while it looks as if the field is a field that is moving ahead with times and in tune with the context, the historically trodden furrows have resulted in the field becoming trapped by historical forces that have caused a stagnation in the field. The next section of the presentation will turn to the COVID pandemic and the impact thereof on the education systems in the world. Then in conclusion, I want to assess the potential of the disruption brought by the pandemic, for the reimagination, for taking comparative and international education forward. So I just said the historical evolution of comparative and international education shows us how the contextual contours of the time, each phase, have shaped the field. It's customary to say that comparative and international education has moved through 7 phases in its development. I'll quickly say a word about each one. The first phase was a phase of travelers' tales since times immemorial. I mean, people traveled around, be it because of war, because of trade, because of exploration. People traveled around and they got into contact with other societies. And they got back to their own societies and own communities. There are all kinds of stories to tell about these alien and foreign cultures, foreign societies, including their ways of education, their ways of raising children. A very primitive and pre-scientific phase in the development of the field. But by the beginning of the 19th century, a new kind of education traveler emerged. Now, many government officials, emissaries were sent by their governments to study what was regarded as exemplary education systems in the world. The aim was to learn from those foreign education systems, to come back, take best practices, best ideas, best policies, and improve the domestic education project, which one should see against the rise of the nation states in the global north at that time, the establishment of national systems of primary education to consolidate the nation-state project. Page again, please.
Next one.
I think you can skip this one too. The next phase was a phase of international cooperation. This phase saw the rationale or the motivation for practicing comparative education from the improvement of the own education system towards serving the interests of humanity, create a better world for everybody. So this is the vision that the French scholar Marc-Antoine Julien also coined the term comparative education, which he had for comparative education. That vision one can see in the things like UNESCO today, the Incheon Declaration, the Education for All initiative, and the Millennium Education Goals. Next phase, which was a bit of a regression, gained traction in the inter-war decades in the global north. Rise of nationalism and inward-looking societies. National education systems were now seen as each one unique, each one being shaped by the national contextual ecology operating in each society, in each state. Next phase was this page that we took. Yeah, thank you. In the decades after the Second World War, with the worldwide economic boom, the decolonization of large parts of the Third World, especially Africa, the Middle East, South and East Asia, and the rapid economic recovery of Europe, an unbounded belief developed in education, in the power of education, to execute any kind of desirable social change. Education was seen, for example, as the main instrument to modernize the nations in the global south. So there was a move to change comparative education into a fully fledged social science, wholesale appropriating the theoretical frameworks and methodologies and paradigms of related social sciences, such as economics, political science, anthropology, development studies, and the like. Scholars try to find a correlation between investment in education on the one hand and societal outcomes on the other hand. For example, thinking about Harbison and Meyer's book, where they calculated a correlation between level of education development and level of economic development of 75 nations.
Next one.
The social science phase and the belief in education of the day spurred a worldwide education expansion drives. See, there was an enrollment explosion since the early 1960s in virtually all parts of the world. However, the 1960s, the education investment eventually did not bring the societal dividends. For example, instead of eradicating unemployment, the boom in schooling led to the specter of school unemployment. This developed slowly in the late 1960s, early 1970s, but it was brought to a head by the 1973 oil slump, oil crisis. So rival paradigms to the modernization theory and structural functionalism of the 1960s appeared in the field. Theories such as social economic reproduction theories, cultural reproduction theories, world system analysis, dependency theories, and the like. So these theories saw education as a powerful tool in the hands of the powerful classes to reinforce inequalities, suppression, and injustices in society. In the 1990s, keeping with the spirit of postmodernism, the variety of paradigms in the field continued to proliferate. There's now also a toleration and even an appreciation of diversity in the field. And also a more tempered belief in the societal elevating power of education. No longer the unbounded optimism of the 1960s, neither the absolute pessimism of the 1970s, but it's a balanced, nuanced view somewhere in between as to what one can achieve with education. No matter how enticing this depiction of comparative education is, which I just gave you, its historical evolution, each time being shaped and keeping up with changes in society. Viewed in another dimension, there's also an impression of stagnation, of being trapped in historically ploughed furrows. So it is to this lamentable situation I will turn to now. I will unpack, mention here five, I won't have time to unpack them, but quickly mention briefly 5 interrelated futures in the field, which the field had assumed at some decisive stage in the past, but which are hampering the field at the present point in time. First one is unresponsiveness, or a lack of new response to new vistas beckoning. For example, the nation state remains the main geographical unit of analysis in the field. To any comparative education journal, you will see a fixation on the order level of the nation state. Yet, the famous Brian Thomas view, almost 30 years ago, these 2 top scholars of comparative education indicated or showed the way for a whole range of geographical levels of analysis. They distinguished between 8 levels, from the world level to the classroom level, which the field has never taken up, never risen to the occasion. Page that one. Let's go back one. Maybe I like this one.
Sorry.
They are I've mentioned earlier in my presentation that there are global education expansion drives, which is placed on the agenda by and for global humanity, such as the Education for All, the Millennium Development Goals, Goal 4 of the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Incheon Declaration. But in all these initiatives and their guiding documents, the scholars of the field of comparative and international education are absent. These drives and their blueprints are being formulated and driven by people outside of the field of comparative and international education. It's also the black box character in the field. Studies in comparative education, most research focus on the societal shaping forces of education. Little bit less on the societal outcomes of education, but there's relatively little attention that scholars spend on what is actually taking place in the education system, in classrooms, in education institutions. Third one is the problem of a lack of an autochthonous theory in the field. Looking to the field, people wholesaling, appropriating theoretical frameworks from outside. Yet scholars in the field have never developed an authentic autochthonous theory which is widely used or usable in the field of comparative and international education. Skip that one. The third one is the problem of northern hegemony. It's a long-standing problem in the field. Most of the scholars are in the global north, working with paradigms and theoretical frameworks and epistemologies based in the global north. And scholars in the global south do not come to their right in journals, especially in books and developing theory in robust discussions in the field. Right. Did you page that one? The last problem is the dwindling presence of the field at universities. The last 30 years, there have been some places where the field did expand in terms of chairs at universities, in terms of program offerings. Likewise, in large parts of the world, the field has been on a downward trajectory with it. Retrenchment, closing of chairs, closing of programs, and the like. That was the state of the field year by 2020, when suddenly and unexpectedly the COVID-19 pandemic hit the world. This pandemic has deepened fault lines in societies, inequalities. And according to the IMF, the global economy has shrunk by 4.4% in 2020. If there's some figures to show you that, to motivate my statement that existing inequalities have been worsened by the field, by the pandemic. For example, the unemployment that the pandemic brought has affected women disproportionately. There's also the problem that the pandemic has give governments all over the world a pretext to encroach more on the autonomy of civil society. Right. Schools are among the worst institutional casualties of complex disasters. COVID-19 is no exception. Before we look at that, just show you that in spite of the worldwide education expansion drive since the 1960s, one can criticize the global education project on many counts. I've drafted that model a long time ago. If you assess any education project, a national or a global education project, you can assess it along 3 dimensions: quantity, enrollments, quality of education offered, and equality of education offered. Now, on all 3 dimensions, even before the pandemic had broken out, education in the world had serious difficulties. For example, on the quantitative dimension, even before the outbreak of the pandemic, 258 million children of school-going age all across the world, or 17% of the cohort, were not attending school. Quality-wise, I can give you even some more frightening figures, statistics, even from what is considered to be top performing education countries in the world, such as Finland. Page that one too. On the equality dimension too, even before the pandemic, education was far from equal all over the world, no matter how you define equality. For example, in the United States of America, the statistical probability of attending a university is 20 to 30% in the case of children of parents from the poorest income category, rising linearly up to 90% for the children of the richest quintile of category of parents. Likewise, equality was then very rife inequality along the lines of especially socio-economic descent, gender, and race or ethnic status. I quoted there some figures, but you can skip them. The outbreak of the pandemic has affected about 91% of the global student population in terms of the closing or suspension of schools, colleges, and university attendance. Even in March 2021, 1 year after the outbreak, it 26 countries, all education institutions were still closed. The knee-jerk response of education authorities worldwide was to change to online learning. Well, we haven't got time to go into it, but in comparative and international education, the history of technology enhanced or technology supported education is, to put it mildly, no unqualified success story. And it is also once again, to rely on homeschooling and parents and the home environment to supplement the school is obviously also disproportionately adversely affecting those children from poor households. In South Africa, a few months into the pandemic, a survey found that 29% of all students lost all contact with their teachers. 79% of schools who were dependent on school fees from parents could not manage to collect such fees. And 51% of schools could not succeed in sending out any homework to their students. So my point is that existing inequalities were exacerbated by the pandemic. Although on the other hand, the renowned education commentator Percy Solberg has shown in a comparative study between Australia and Finland that education systems can make visionary, innovative, nifty plans to deftly handle the pandemic and the way it is adversely impacting on the education of children. Last year, in one of the top journals in the field, we compared Oleksienko and others, few renowned scholars in the field, offered their thoughts and their reflections on the implications of the pandemic for comparative and international education. I make the point that this exacerbation of inequalities, the regression in access to schooling that the pandemic brought, leaves no room for experimentation. So I want to link that to what the South African scholar said. As Emil Durkheim, one of the ground layers of sociology, said that comparison between societies, learning from the experiences of other societies, is indirect experimentation. And as these scholars and Cherry said, well, we haven't got the luxury to experiment with new things. This gives, to me, new meaning for comparative education. Let us learn from each other how to handle the pandemic and its adverse effects, how to handle that and to support the education effort to children. So this, I think, offers for agile, comparative and international education scholars an opportunity to get rid of some of the shackles that have been in the field. More focus on pedagogy, what is happening in classrooms, on leadership, on policy issues immediately related to the pandemic. Also on longer-standing issues in the field, such as access to education, quality, equality, and equity, can get the field, for example, to escape the black box syndrome, which I outlined earlier. It is also at the global level that we need new initiatives. And here too, I see the comparative education community can now for once get involved in global initiatives, not sit at the sideline as he did with Incheon, with Education for All, with the Millennium Development Goals. I think the field of comparative international education can best give direct direction to the world, the global reconstruction and progress in education from a body of authentic theory. Building up such a theory should give due recognition to the global south, with the bulk of education enrollments and most education institutions are situated in any case. So that can also bring the opportunity to develop autonomous theory in the field, and also to give the global south its rightful place in the field, in the construction of knowledge. So that is how I see the potential, the promise, how we can, in the field, can use the pandemic, the predicament of the pandemic, to improve education in the world, and also at the same time to renew the field and to take the field forward. That is my argument.
Many thanks, Charles.
Give you something to think about.
Yeah. La idea que haya a continuación es conversar, ¿cierto?, con el profesor Walhuter, tanto quienes estamos acá presentes en esta sala de reuniones del IESET, como también quienes están participando a través de la plataforma Zoom. Todos los profesores y estudiantes, ¿cierto?, que estén conectados podrán hacer preguntas a través del chat, ¿ya? Ahí Luis nos va a ayudar con las preguntas que lleguen para traducírselas al profesor Walhuter. Que el foro a partir de ahora está abierto, colegas, y háganos llegar sus inquietudes a través de esa vía. En el intertanto, cedo la palabra a mis colegas acá en la sala. No sé quién quiere abrir los fuegos. Who is going to open the fire with the char? Nobody? Char, how can we overpass the problems stayed by the COVID-19 pandemic regarding comparative and international education? We know that there are a lot of problems that we have to face as comparativist researchers, right? And one of those problems, like you highlight in your presentation, is the monopoly of the big alliances, the financial alliances like World Bank, OECD, UNESCO. How can we overpass that problem? Because we know that they manage big databases, right? And we as single scholars have a lot of problems to access to reliable and timely data, right? And for that reason, we don't have, in Latin America and also in Chile, we don't have a comparative education society, with the exception of Argentina, Brazil, Cuba, and then the other countries that don't have comparative education society. So we have a huge weakness, right? Yeah. So what do you think? How can we overpass that problem?
I agree. There's widespread criticism in the field that the global education agenda is being driven by the international financial world, the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, and a variation of that is also by the military industrial complex in the global north. A bigger variation of the argument is that the global education agenda is being driven by the global north. Well, we have 43 comparative education societies worldwide. Whether they constitute the World Council of Comparative Education Societies. I think as comparative education scholars, our first task is to prove our mettle, to sell ourselves to people in cognate fields of educational scholarship, education leadership, education administration, sociology of education, policy studies. That may be a first step. Together with the building of a stronger organizational base, that can give us some leverage. From there, we must, once we have solidified our organizational base and sold ourselves to the cognate fields of education scholarship, we can try and reach the parents, the teachers, from there, the public education discourse. Get a foot in the door, and say, and win the respect of everybody in the public education discourse. That would be a good. From what people they can pick up from us, they can use. They exercise their democratic rights, for example. That might be a way to break the monopoly and the undue strong influence that some international bodies, some institutions in the global north have on also the education project in the global south.
But it's not an easy task to break the monopoly.
It's a long-term task.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
You can, fight your, argue with your colleagues at every university faculty of education, argue with them and show them the value of beefing up comparative education courses and programs and getting chairs of education, comparative education established.
Okay, Patricia, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. I want to ask in the same line,
Yeah.
probably, but not in the high organization system. But very related, I think I hear you talk about the lack of theory, like a new phase in the comparative education research since the 1990s. At the same time, we have a big massification of the entire system worldwide. We have like 4 or 5 million of people in higher education in Latin America countries. We have, I don't know, 30, 40 million. I don't remember the exact number right now. But in Chile, we have a 7 times bigger system. But however, we have implementation also in the research in all the fields. And we watch the data and we have a lot of new publication. But this lack of theory, I think, is probably because we have the same reference and the same reference on the same journals. In the same journal in the north. Control in English most of it, and if we have a lack of local research, we don't see. We try to copy the same research that the North do in our country. We don't design our own methodological ways to do new research. So. Do you think this is possible? The same system of the journals, the way of science, is in the editors who own these journals responsible indirectly from this situation?
I think that's a fact that That's one of the problems in the, not only in comparative education, but in the scholarly community as a whole. Journal editors are the gatekeepers of knowledge. They are in an untouchable position. They are accountable to nobody. On top of that, in all fields, the top journals in any field is situated in the global north. So as you have said, that gives the global north an advantage. It can almost dictate the research agenda, it can dictate the epistemology, it can decide what will get published and what will not get published. These what I've mentioned here, that northern hegemony is a problem in the field and beyond comparative education too.
Yeah, you know, in Latin America, I think we have perhaps 2 journals focusing on comparative education, just 2. So, and if you check out what happened in Europe or the United States, you will find out there are many journals that accept papers regarding comparative or international education. But as Patricio mentioned before, journal editor manage and control all the publications. So when people from, for example, the global south or from developing countries send out manuscripts to these prestigious journals managed by British or American scholars, usually, and you have experienced this, they reject, right? They reject and they don't send out to external evaluation. Only because we are part of the poorest countries, right? The developing countries. So we are not competing under the same rules with researchers coming from the global north. That's the main problem that we are facing every day. No?
We are on a soccer field, 45 degrees still to the coast. This is Michael Apple himself from America once.
¿Alguien más quiere preguntar algo, comentar,
complementar? In the same line, I don't want to move from the same topic.
Hay preguntas.
There's a situation, we have like in Scopus 800 journals in Latin America, 800 only. And there's nearly 26,000, I think, in the last, in Scopus is more according to social issues, probably local problems, there are more journals according to that. So I think, like a year ago, in my PhD, but I tried in most of the research, cite authors who have more highly cited, I don't know,
citations.
More citation. Okay. There's a situation, especially after Garfield and the Web of Science origin, the more citation is more quality. But those situations are the same threads of knowledge according to all authors come from the developed countries who have more tradition in that area. So I think meanwhile there's no strategy for the Latin American countries or another developing countries to make more of this journal or in Web of Science and Scopus. We keep the same problem. We don't have not enough people who research, not enough journals to show ourselves or research, and we don't have money for research. But we spend a lot of money in education in general. So.
It's difficult for us to, I'm also from the global south, to get a foot in the door. It's difficult for us to build up a strong citation index because of what we see.
but definitely we should strengthen the relationship between among researchers coming from the global south. For example, the collaboration that Char and I that we have been making the last year have been produced some chapters and articles. And recently, for example, Char led an article regarding educational narratives, which is a good, it's a nice piece of paper that contribute to the discussion on educational theory. And that paper was accepted by Compare, which is one of the most prestigious journal in the field. And we are writing together along with Noel McGinn. Noel McGinn also has been waiting in that manuscript. And actually, we start to write a new manuscript. Char sent me out a couple of days ago a revision of articles published in the Comparative Education Review over the last decade, between 2010 and 2019. It's a great effort made by Charles, and then with Noel, we start to review that manuscript and give some feedback to Charles in order to produce a new paper. So I'm bringing this example as a way to overpass the influence of external agencies. We have to strengthen our networks. It's the only way to put our knowledge, our contributions in track. Otherwise, we will continue isolated and we will be unable to make some contribution in the field. So we have to fight every day, every week, every month against the journal editors, right? And also we have to fight against the international agencies like World Bank, OECD, or even UNESCO. We are competing under unequal conditions as researchers. So, but I think, Char, that there are chances, there are space to make contributions, and our experience is a good example. So we have to stimulate, to foster our colleagues to imitate it, to this kind of initiatives in order to publish in prestigious journals. So it's possible. It takes a long time, for sure, but it's possible. So that's an example that I want to take to the meeting. ¿Alguien más? Sí, perdón. We have a question from the chat. Trevor Driscoll. Trevor is a scholar that works in the University of Tarapacá. He asked the following question, Char. Can you project? ¿Puedes proyectarla o no? Yo la puedo leer, pero si tú se la pudieras proyectar, siempre que no desconectes nada, ten cuidado. Ahí está. That's the first question. Pensé que era una pregunta para... No. No es una...
We have to, if I say technology is a good, yeah, it's a good servant, but a dangerous master. Technology is a good servant, but a dangerous master. We got to seize technology before people with devious intentions will work against our detriment before they do it. One of the ways we can do that is what I'm exploring here on this mission, is to look at self-collaboration. But we take control and take ownership of technology, use it to our advantage. Otherwise, other people will come, take technology and use it to their advantage. That's a very, very, very important question that we must keep in mind. As we restructure education post-pandemic and as we are looking at the post-pandemic research agenda in comparative and international education. Thank you for that question.
Gracias, Trevor. Thank you. ¿Alguien más quiere preguntar, consultar? Uy, Eduardo, está muy callado.
Soy yo.
Que sea en español, porque era en español y la traducimos acá. ¿Ah? ¿No? Nada. Tú que has trabajado tanto en educación comparada. Tiene harto para compartir, pero compartir alguna experiencia a partir de algún estudio. Okay, go ahead.
My experience itself was with network, especially with European and Latin American universities, about 40 universities, and about 200 people. But the change in this way were more practical things and practical problem more than theoretical problem. We can say that we make applied research in terms of, for instance, priority areas for research. For instance, to decide that. For instance, to how to improve teaching things in universities, or to have more, to improve the management of knowledge, and to apply as soon as possible research in the university and the practice. Way of this kind of ways of applied research, I experience it. And but not in the way that we're talking here, which is more theoretical research. But have a good experience, by the way, sorry. But we have a very good experience with the change. We have a very good experience for networking system in all this university. We are a very strong community. So and we produce a lot of books and things like that. Materials also, teaching materials. Sorry.
Germany has just mentioned the Compare. There's just been a publication, an article of North-South collaboration. And now one must be very careful that such partnerships do not work in the interest of the global North, but also in the interest of the global South partner. Which has just been published in Compare.
Yeah. And you know, Luis Eduardo published, I think 18 or 17 years ago, a report for UNESCO about the factors that influence dropping out in higher education in Latin American countries. This piece of paper, this report was published in 2005, right? I'm right? Yes. So after that publication, nobody has studied the phenomenon of dropping out in Latin America. Why? Because data is diffuse, is not updated, so it's not easy to update the research that Luis Eduardo led 15 or 20 years ago. That demonstrate what difficult is for Latin American comparative researchers to do research. Yeah, so we have many problems to get reliable and timely data.
And finally, also large distances, bringing people together, bringing scholars together.
Yeah. For that reason, so in South Africa happened the same, and
Or even worse,
in other third world
Like in Europe,
countries,
where you-
it's the same problem. See?
a few hours by train from anywhere in Europe.
Yeah.
You are in the Netherlands or France or anywhere. We are, Africa, even email communication is not all that. Useful.
Ujú. ¿Pregunta? Leerla. Okay. Charles, there is other question. I'm gonna read it. Hi, Professor, say Jimena Cataldo. Please, any advice for us as early career researchers on how to start comparative research in higher education, especially considering the challenge of including qualitative aspects?
I think that
Nice question.
what you should consider is to go to CIES, right? The Comparative and International Education Society in America. So having every year a conference, next year in March in Washington DC on equity is the theme of this. And they have a special interest group on higher education. Your first priority would be to get to a CIES meeting, to join that SIG, to get acquainted with people in that SIG.
Jimena, voy a traducir. Charles sugiere, bueno, y lo digo para todos los jóvenes, hay un par de espacios muy importantes en el mundo de la educación comparada, que son el Comparative International Education Society, que aglutina a alrededor de 2.000, 3.000 investigadores que se enfocan en temas de educación comparada y que se reúnen anualmente en alguna ciudad de Estados Unidos o de Centroamérica. Y otro espacio que es muy rico también para aprender y conocer a los profesores académicos, a los scholars, ¿cierto? Que trabajan en temas de educación comparada y educación internacional, es la ERA, la American Educational Research Association, ¿ya? Y también existe otro espacio que no es tan directo, que es LASA, en la cual también yo soy miembro, que es la Latin American Studies Association, y donde hay una sección vinculada, destinada a educación, ¿ya? Y que también se reúne una vez al año. Entonces, esos espacios son sumamente ricos, son potentes, y permiten a los investigadores jóvenes o que están iniciando sus carreras académicas relacionarse con profesores, con académicos que ya tienen más trayectoria, que tienen publicaciones en el cuerpo y que a uno le enseñan mucho. Yo, por experiencia propia, comentar que cuando yo empecé mi doctorado en la Universidad de Pittsburgh, mi advisor en ese entonces, que era Mark Ginsburg, llevaba a sus alumnos desde el primer año a estos congresos, ¿ya? Y fueron muy enriquecedores. La verdad que yo aprendí mucho ahí, conocí a la mayoría de los gurús que existen en el mundo en estos temas, y por lo tanto el crecimiento que uno adquiere en este tipo de eventos son fundamentales. Y me atrevería también a mencionar los eventos que ha estado organizando mi amigo Norberto Fernández Lamarra, quien es parte de la directiva del World Comparative Education Society, y cuya organización, cierto, en algunas ocasiones ha realizado congresos en América del Sur, particularmente en Argentina, y me parece que en Brasil, ¿ya? También me tocó la oportunidad de participar ahí, y en esa ocasión básicamente nos encontramos con investigadores latinoamericanos. Mientras que en los otros espacios que comentaba anteriormente, el CIES, LASA o AERA, ¿cierto? Uno tiene la posibilidad de compartir con investigadores de todo el mundo, de Europa, de África, de Oceanía, América del Norte. Entonces es una oportunidad que es imperdible. O sea, yo se la recomendaría, y tal como lo hacía Charles, que hacían a cualquier investigador emergente, que quiera sumergirse, ¿cierto? Empaparse más de lo que es la educación comparada y la educación internacional. Así que espero que estos tips te sirvan de algo, Jimena. Gracias. ¿Alguna otra pregunta, Luis? ¿No? ¿De los participantes externos? ¿No? ¿Colega? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿No? ¿Bruno? ¿Ninguna? No. ¿Y por qué estáis tan callados hoy día? Y en español, si quieres yo lo traduzco. Si te explica el idioma. Karina, ¿no? Ninguna. ¿Les quedó todo claro? ¿Y les gustó o no les gustó? Ciertamente, I'm going to speak in Spanish. Sorry.
I can understand.
Okay.
Just speak it
I'm going
over.
to speak slowly. Ciertamente, estamos hablando de un campo, tal como lo manifestaba Char en su presentación, ¿cierto? Que ha ido avanzando gradualmente, que ha ido incorporando nuevos scholars, nuevos investigadores, pero que en paralelo, ¿cierto?, tiene que enfrentar distintos desafíos producto de las dificultades que tenemos para acceder a información confiable, ¿ya? Y oportuna. Incluso más, por ejemplo, si ustedes ven lo que está ocurriendo en América Latina, generalmente los pocos estudios comparados que se han llevado adelante, diría, en los últimos 20 años, dan cuenta de realidades de 2 o 3 países, no más que eso. Y eso se explica en gran medida por la dificultad de acceder a data, a información confiable y oportuna. Generalmente, quienes incursionamos en la arena de la educación comparada y la educación internacional, nos encontramos con que la data, la información, ¿cierto?, es muy desigual. Por ejemplo, podemos tener datos de, no sé, de permanencia o de desempeño académico, o incluso datos de titulación o inserción laboral, en algunos países, años 2019, 2020, y en otros países de la región de América Latina, la información más actual va a ser del 2015 o 2010, como pasa, por ejemplo, con Bolivia, con Perú, con Paraguay, ¿cierto?, que tienen sistemas de información que están bastante atrasados. Y eso también refuerza un poco esta idea que hemos estado comentando en este foro, en este workshop, ¿cierto?, de las dificultades que tenemos los quienes somos amantes de la educación comparada e internacional por llevar adelante estos estudios. Sin ir más lejos, hace algunos meses yo le ofrecía a mi colega que estuvo la semana pasada acompañándonos en el Seminario de Equidad en Educación Superior, Ana García Fanelli, colega argentina, yo le decía, Ana, ¿por qué no hacemos un estudio comparado, Chile-Argentina, sobre este otro tema? Pero Oscar, es que en Argentina no tenemos data, no tenemos información actual como tienen ustedes en Chile. Por lo tanto, es muy complicado. Entonces, ahí tienen un claro ejemplo de las limitaciones que tenemos y que tienen, ¿cierto?, todos aquellos investigadores y tesistas, ¿por qué no decirlo? Hay tesistas que se lanzan también a hacer estudios comparados, a veces con casos bien específicos, tanto en el nivel escolar como el superior, y que enfrentan dificultades de tamaño mayor, que no son difíciles de superar, y que dan cuenta además de limitaciones de carácter metodológico, porque cuando uno prepara un estudio de esta naturaleza, muchas veces es difícil justificar metodológicamente, ¿cierto?, este desbalance, gracias Francisco, este desbalance que hay a nivel de información entre distintos países de la región, o del tercer mundo, hablemos del tercer mundo, de países subdesarrollados como el nuestro, ¿ya? Y eso también produce un retraso, ¿cierto?, en la calidad y en la frecuencia de las publicaciones que estamos generando en relación, ¿cierto?, al mundo desarrollado. O sea, el mundo desarrollado va en jet y nosotros vamos en monopatín, ¿no? Y es una realidad que tenemos que asumir, lamentablemente, y que yo espero que en un futuro no muy lejano podamos superar y podamos, ¿cierto?, de alguna manera competir en igualdad de condiciones con los colegas del mundo desarrollado. Espero hacerlo antes de que me muera.
Competir, profesor, cooperar. No sé,
Perdón, cooperar. Bueno, y en este marco de cooperación creo que les mencioné que vamos a traer próximamente a Tristan McCowan. Maybe I mentioned. Yeah, he works at the University College London. He's very famous scholar. He's a former editor of
Well, you
Compare.
could introduce him to that person who asked the question.
Good question.
Somebody from asked the question is, what advice I can give to early career comparative people who want to do in higher education. You know, Tristan McCowan published a book just recently on higher education and the sustainable development goals. So to introduce those people to him might be a very valuable experience to them, to put them on the research track.
Sí, está mencionando Char que hay un libro publicado recientemente por mi colega Tristan McCowan que puede ser útil también para ustedes, colegas en Arica, que quieran incursionar en temas de educación comparada internacional. Así que pueden buscar el texto que menciona Char en la web, ¿cierto? Y consultarlo. Y así como ese, bueno, hay otras publicaciones que pueden ser de bastante utilidad y respecto de las cuales podemos conversar en futuros encuentros, en futuros conversatorios como el que estamos llevando a cabo en estos momentos. ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? ¿No?
No, gracias nomás de comentar.
Ya.
Mira el chat, por favor.
Ahí en el chat hay 11.
No, es que son los anteriores.
Ya, salud, ya. ¿Alguna otra consulta, colega? ¿No? ¿Está todo claro? ¿Luis Eduardo? ¿No? Bueno.
I am trying to forge a partnership between our universities, Professor Spinoza and me. I hope that will be successful, and I hope that we can collaborate together in future, and this won't be the last time that pass. We can work together and do a lot to push global northern hegemony back.
Yeah.
We can pool forces.
Por supuesto, dice el profesor Wolfhuter, si no entendieron que este puede ser el puntapié de inicio de futuras colaboraciones, ¿ya? De hecho, está invitándonos también a ir a Sudáfrica en algún momento, a compartir alguna experiencia investigativa. Están las puertas abiertas. Yo me alegro mucho de haber contado con el profesor Char el día de hoy. La verdad que ha sido una experiencia muy enriquecedora. Me alegro que ustedes hayan asistido también, y a los colegas de Arica, obviamente darles las gracias por participar de este workshop, y bueno, esperar contar con ustedes para futuras oportunidades. Ojalá que la tecnología no nos falle y podamos tener un traductor, que fue lo que nos falló hoy, pero ojalá que hayan podido entender al menos parte de lo que presentó el profesor Wolfhuter, porque sin duda es una presentación de mucho valor, que da cuenta de una gran experiencia, de una trayectoria, y vamos a hacer visible también esta presentación próximamente a través de la página del doctorado, ¿cierto? En educación de la UTA, como también a través de la página del IESER. Así que quienes estén interesados en acceder a la presentación del profesor Wolfhuter van a poder verla, ¿cierto?, en alguno de estos dos repositorios. Dicho eso, sí.
No, una pregunta cortita que me surgió a propósito, tuve que salir, que me surgió a propósito de tu diagnóstico, que los que hemos intentado hacer trabajo a nivel de Latinoamérica corroboramos, es decir, hay un desbalance, una asimetría entre los países que incluso dificulta la producción científica, porque ese desbalance tiene que ver también con el avance que tienen algunos países en términos de la comunicación. O sea, si uno mira en general, Chile está bastante avanzado en eso. Hay una mirada muy real en términos de que si tú haces una investigación, el próximo paso es la comunicación de esa investigación. Cosa que en otros países está recién comenzando a tratarse. Tú mencionabas Bolivia, mencionabas Paraguay, pero pensemos en nuestros vecinos, los peruanos. Hay ciertas áreas que tienen un desarrollo en eso y otras que están recién empezando a entender de que si tú haces una investigación, el siguiente paso es la publicación. Entonces tenemos esa asimetría por varios lados. Entonces la pregunta, ¿qué pasa en Sudáfrica? Si el fenómeno es similar cómo lo enfrentan, porque de pronto uno dice, claro, esto también tiene que ver un poco con lo precario de la inversión que se hace en investigación y desarrollo en Latinoamérica y en general en los países subdesarrollados, entonces eso lleva a que tengamos esos desbalances. Chile es una situación en particular porque probablemente el modelo que se instaló de alguna manera incentivó a que las universidades se orienten hacia la comunicación. Y hoy día, ¿cierto? Chile muestra indicadores que son absolutamente de liderazgo en la región, en términos de producción científica. Pero el resto sigue con estos problemas, pues nosotros también los tenemos, o sea, observamos que hay poca inversión en investigación y desarrollo, pero en otros países el tema es igual de complejo. Quizás ahora Brasil, porque Brasil está invirtiendo mucho en investigación y desarrollo, entonces uno está observando que las universidades se están moviendo mucho hacia la publicación científica. Uno observa que las bases de datos Scopus y WOPS, cada vez hay más revistas brasileñas que se están adhiriendo a esta base de datos, pero en el resto de Latinoamérica sigue siendo muy pobre. No sé, por ejemplo, en Perú, ¿cuántas revistas veíamos la vez que eran Scopus?
Como 10,
Creo que eran 26 en Perú.
bueno, pero sí, dijo el parecido de los pocos que hay, pero he dicho siempre Latinoamérica.
Y solamente eso. Entonces,
Déjame preguntar.
dale.
Char, Francisco, want to know what happened in South Africa regarding investment in research and the level of publications that scholars, South African scholars make. Have you experienced some progress over the last decade, or you are having problems to get funding from the state to fund research and publish later on?
You know, we were subject to the international academic boycott, 1960 to 1990. So before 1990, if you, for example, if I sent a manuscript to the Comparative Education Review, they return it back to me just like that and say, sorry, at this stage, we can't consider South African contributions. So we had to start more or less from a null, a not base level in 1990. The number of publications, the rate of publications by academics have increased, although it is not matching what you get in the global north. I think the average number of publications by academics is not the same as in the global north. We get reasonably well funded for research. We have a National Research Foundation that gets a block grant from government each year. They dispense it between academics. The problem we experience in South Africa in publication is that we have too heavy a workload at our universities. We don't get proper time to do research. Research takes an enormous amount of time. We have a very demanding and ill-prepared student body. We have a regimen of managerialism, of performativity measurement and performance appraisal at our universities unmatched anywhere in the world. So we are, apart from the general problem of the northern hegemony, South Africa academics who do research face these two problems. We're fairly well funded, but we have far too heavy a workload. The managerialism is to such an extent that it stifles creativity and initiative. These are the two problems we experience with research.
¿Puedes comentar un poco? Ya entendí algo, pero ¿puedes comentar un poquito de la respuesta?
Can you repeat?
I
missed the main argument. Sorry.
We were cut off from the international world until 1990. They wouldn't accept our manuscripts, they wouldn't accept foreign visitors. So we had to start in 1990 from a new baseline.
Dice, perdón, que a partir de con anterioridad al año 90 había muchas dificultades para obtener financiamiento, pero que después de ese año el gobierno establece una línea base, ¿verdad? Para estimular un poco la productividad y la investigación dentro del país. Go ahead.
We get reasonably well funded by government to do research. Our publication rate output did increase impressively since 1990. It is not the same as the publication rate of academics, say, in America or Germany, but it has grown a lot since 1990.
Entonces, que está creciendo también el nivel de producción y de publicaciones desde los 90, pero no está al nivel de lo que uno puede ver en América del Norte.
Bueno, nosotros lo mismo prácticamente, porque el profesor decía, bueno, producimos más que Latinoamérica, pero nosotros debemos contratarnos por población con Holanda.
Claro,
pero produzcan triple que nosotros. Y no tenemos ni idea, estamos un tercio del óptimo de...
Porque ellos manejan los journals.
Bueno, esa es otra parte.
Eso es el colegio.
So our problem, what is hampering South African academics to raise their research output is, firstly, heavy teaching loads, very demanding students. And secondly, the whole culture of managerialism, of performativity, a very heavy administrative load that we have. Attending meetings, filing reports, writing reports, filling in forms. These things take all our time. Attending to students, their requests, advising students. These things keep South African researchers from enhancing their research output. Heavy teaching load and managerialism, the administrative load we have. Universities.
Lo que pasa acá también, el tema del managerialismo, el gerencialismo está muy presente en el quehacer del académico sudafricano.
O sea, el modelo se parece un poco
al... Y el tema de la performance, del desempeño también, o sea, el publish or perish, right? O sea, publicar o morir.
Claro.
También están experimentando lo mismo, desde los 90 en adelante. Parecido a lo que estamos viendo nosotros, claro. Estamos al mismo nivel geográficamente y estamos experimentando los mismos problemas.
Por eso que me interesaba conocer la
claro, sí, esa es la gracia de tener encuentros y conversaciones con profesores que vienen, ¿cierto?, de otros continentes, pero que tienen los mismos problemas que nosotros. ¿Sí? Claro. Y ahí nosotros podemos también aprender y ver posibles vías de colaboración, de asociatividad para llevar adelante acciones en el futuro. Porque tenemos las mismas necesidades, mismos problemas. We have the same problems, same needs. I'm explaining my colleague why we should strengthen collaboration with countries like South Africa or other Global South countries. Yeah.
Interesante.
Sí.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to add something else, Charles? Okay. In order to finish this conversation, I want to give you thanks, Charles. We have enjoyed this time sharing with you, and we have learned a lot. And we hope to see you in the near future. I guess that we will be able to invite you in maybe next year. So thanks again. We appreciate your presentation, your time. And after our conversation today, I hope that you will be able to travel to Arica next week, maybe, and to deliver a conference, perhaps to participate in a seminar with the colleagues of our doctoral program. So I will let you know what happened tomorrow. Thanks again, Charles. Y gracias a todos los que asistieron al taller y a quienes están participando a distancia también vía Zoom. Esperamos verlo en una próxima oportunidad y buenas tardes. Nos vemos.